Hello and welcome back to Season 4, Episode 2 of the Ask Podcast. Very exciting today to have a guest that I'll introduce you to in a moment. But before that, let's remind ourselves who we are. I'm Mrs. Jenni Summers, the Deputy Head of English and Drama. John Hamden.
And I'm Mr. Till, and I'm the head of English, and these days do things with the sixth form as well.
He does too much, is what he's trying to say, but that's Mr. Till all over. And we've got 3 lovely panellists, 2 out of 3 returning, 1 brand new panelist. I'll let you introduce yourselves, say something about yourself. Could just be what subjects you love, but it could be something quirky about yourself. I don't mind. Go.
Hi, I'm Harry. I take GCSE history, which hopefully means I'm somewhat qualified to explore this topic.
I like the idea of being having qualifications to talk about something. I like the idea of
that. I'm Josh. I do A-level history, similarly, and I'm glad to have been allowed to return.
After your fab performance in the last podcast, straight back, returning guest.
I'm Addy, and I did history in year 7 and 8, and I enjoyed it.
Fair enough. And your English teacher, speaks very highly of you, so I have high expectations of you today. And by the way, Sir in the corner here, our guest, is looking quite daunted by that profile as a starting point. But let us, without further ado, introduce our wonderful guest. We've got Mr. Khan, not only, of course, in the fantastic English department, goes without saying, but also head of now year 10. So he's also a person who has way too much on his plate, but he's very kindly said that he would come and chat about his topic, lovely controversial topic of Malcolm X. And I'm going to start off with our usual question, which is, why Malcolm X, please, sir?
Malcolm X is the lesser known, but still formative figure in black civil rights during the early 1960s. And as I was sort of casting my eyes over the Ballot or the Bullet, which is one of his well-known speeches, I was just reminded of how salient so many of the things he spoke about were and continue to be, and how the echoes of those ideas still resonate 60 years after he made that speech.
A good opening pitch, I think. I think Harry's looking like he wants to get in on that action there and supply us with the question. Panellists, I'm putting it out to you.
Well, shall we just start with what some of Malcolm X's ideas were, or his
statements?
Because we probably have listeners who
that's a good point.
Might have heard the name, but know no more than the name. Really, in brief, Malcolm X, who was he? Why do we still talk about him?
Great point.
If you go back, you realise that the point at which he became a public figure was shortly after he was released from prison. He went to prison for a succession of petty crimes, including burglary. His given name, his birth name, would have been Malcolm Little, I believe it was. It was when he went to prison that he was mentored to some extent by Elijah Muhammad, who was a renowned figure in the Nation of Islam. And the changing of his name to X was because he believed Little to be his slave name. So it would have been the name given to him by his ancestral slave owners. And so he changed it to X as a rejection of that part of his identity. He had somewhat of a troubled relationship with the Nation of Islam because they were advocates of black separatism, believing that it was only really possible for black people to thrive in their own communities, separated from white individuals, which was inevitably controversial then and immediately and definitely controversial now. When he moved away from the nation and made a pilgrimage to Mecca, performed Hajj, and became an advocate of orthodox Islam, he changed his name to Malik al-Shabazz, which is the name that he took to his grave, and formed the NOAU, the National Organization of Afro-American Unity. And so the Malcolm X of perhaps the early 1960s, the member of the Nation of Islam, was a far different figure to the Malik al-Shabazz, who was assassinated in an Obdurman ballroom in 1965 when he was delivering a speech, and kind of started to separate what appeared to be a scuffle between some members of the audience, and then he was shot several times in the middle of that speech. So controversial in the earlier part of his life, but part of the speech I'll share with you today was called the Ballot or the Bullet, which is kind of relevant in terms of what we were saying. Shows a movement away from that earlier violent rhetoric to a more conciliatory tone.
There we go. Thank you for that lovely overview. Panelists, now are you feeling more like you've got something to grab onto? Give it a go. Don't mind who.
I do have a question. As you said, he figureheads for black civil rights. Do you think it was the manner in which he died in such a violent, visceral event that is the reason why? Is it sort of added to his legacy in a sense?
I think that's certainly part of it. I think you also need to recognise the significance of popular culture. Spike Lee made a movie of his autobiography with Denzel Washington in the lead role. A compelling movie, an epic movie. It's about 3 hours. I watched it at a very young age. And bringing a public figure like that to a wider audience, and it was, in my opinion, quite an honest portrayal because it depicted the controversies in which he was involved, as well as his power as an orator, would certainly have made him more widely known to a broader audience. I think it's inescapable his comparisons with Martin Luther King, who was obviously a sort of proponent of non-violent protests. Selma, this film that was released a couple of years ago, which is quite well known, the March to Selma was a significant moment in civil rights history. But I think one of the most important reasons why he's so well known is the fact that his tact and approach to changing the narrative surrounding black people in the early 1960s, when their freedoms were still limited so gravely, was visceral and powerful.
I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna jump in. I feel like jumping in. I feel like I might be slightly channeling Mr. Lowe here, who's prompting me with all these things. But I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, because you've obviously got a very nuanced view on him because you've read a huge amount about him. You know a lot about him. But isn't he, for most people, isn't he a symbol of by any means necessary? Isn't the thing he's associated today primarily with the fact that he thought it was violence could be justified in the sort of seeking of the rights that they clearly deserved? Isn't that what people associate him with now, and isn't that what inspired movements that came after him and arguably even still today?
I think so. I think when I hear the phrase by any means necessary, I picture the poster, if you've ever seen it. If you go into a black bookshop or part of South London, you see a photo of Malcolm X with a shotgun in his hand, standing with his beside a window. Shortly after he left the nation, his house was attacked, allegedly by Nation of Islam members, and he had to flee his home and take shelter with a friend. And so the fact that he was a character, an individual rather, who was targeted, I believe, because he was so influential and because he was so respected originally by Elijah Muhammad, meant that when you take someone with that ability to communicate a message with such clarity and such power, and that person kind of moves around so that they no longer speak for you, but they in fact openly speak out against you, that can be deemed as a threat. And I think it applies as much in modern politics now, when a politician in the House of Commons crosses the floor, the first thing they do is talk about how terrible the party they stood for actually was. And I think that Malcolm X doing that 50 years ago was as powerful, if not more powerful, than a politician crossing the floor today.
Are you uneasy about his willingness to at least contemplate violence? Or do you think it was necessary at that time as part of the broader struggle?
Another big question there.
I think there's violence that takes place, and I think that there's violent rhetoric. I think that when I read Malcolm X and when I hear Malcolm X, I view him as an individual who perceived of the black people he represented and later on the Muslim people he represented as individuals who were targeted as subjects of violence, and not violence merely because of their race in a physical way, but as victims of violence as perpetrated by the state. When he discusses the limitations imposed upon people of colour by virtue of their inability to vote, I see echoes of that in recent years, in the election in 2016 and before. There are still allegations, there are still mentions of voter suppression in parts of America in recent elections. And so it's difficult to view that in the modern day and not link back to speeches that are 50 years old and see that they're echoes of the suppression of the black voice that existed in America in the early 1960s doesn't still ring true, admittedly to a lesser extent, in 2022.
Damning indictment of modern society there, but yeah, fair enough. My other panellists, have you got some things to say?
What is your opinion on the quite controversial quote in which Malcolm X states that, I believe, I agree with the white man that segregation shouldn't exist?
I think that's useful in pinpointing the change in his character. I think that it is an argument not without merit that the opinions and values expressed by Malcolm X when he was still in the Nation of Islam perhaps bordered on racist. And it's quite no, I don't think I can express that clearer. I think it's true. I think if he called for black separatism and the way in which he didn't believe that white people could in fact be part of black people's journey to equality, he ultimately held white people accountable. And in addition to that, there were many instances where the views he expressed were problematic. And so, as to the extent to which that reflects, I wouldn't call it naivety, because he was about 40, 41, 42 or something when he died, so we're still talking about a man in his late 30s, as old as I am now. If I said something like that, it's not naive, it's foolish. But I think the fact that he moves away from that in later years reveals that his understanding of race relations became more nuanced, and that he was, by the time of his death, I believe, a figure who was willing to collaborate more so than he would have been when he first came out of prison and joined the nation.
Sure.
This is almost like a bit like some of the books and novels and plays that we look at, that the characters have an arc, that they're not one static human being, that they evolve, they become
Absolutely, I think that
different people.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to look at any historical figure and say either that they are without fault or that they are not capable of some sort of growth. And I think the same certainly applies to Malcolm X.
Well, you spoke about how he joined the Nation of Islam in prison. So how did his sort of religious views impact what he spoke for, and how did it impart on the people he spoke to?
This again comes in phases. I think when he first leaves prison as a member of the Nation of Islam, he is still quite radical in his approach and doesn't believe that everyone can be involved or everyone can be responsible for achieving the goal of racial equality. It's only in the later years of his life where he, as a result of, as you said, the attacks on his home, as a result of the people who were seeking to undermine him and who allegedly were responsible for his ultimate murder, it's only when he moves away from the nation and, like I said, undergoes that rite of passage of performing Hajj and embracing orthodox Islam, that his rhetoric becomes more measured, it becomes more peaceful, it becomes more focused on a solution. whereas it isn't always that way with him.
Is that a good link to have a little bit of the speech?
So
I was
the
gonna say
part
the
for
same
me, so the part for me that I find quite interesting is where he says here. So essentially, what he's talking about is he's advocating for the right of black people to be involved in the democratic process. And we're talking about 1964, so it's within 50 years. This is when my father was 8 years old, and so my father would have been 4 years away from coming to live in, or 2 years away from coming to live in this country at the age of 10. And I think that's part of why Malcolm X's story resonates with me, that the end of his life and the beginning of my father's life overlap.
So this speech is from towards the end of his.
He died, he was killed in 1965, at the start of 1965. And he says, "It's time now for you and me to become more politically mature and realise what the ballot is for, what we're supposed to get when we cast a ballot. And that if we don't cast a ballot, it's going to end up in a situation where we're going to have to cast a bullet. It's either a ballot or a bullet." And so I see that as an enticement or an encouragement to the people who would listen to him and take heed of what he says, to participate in the democratic process. And that links back to what I was saying before, that the problems that he states, some of the problems that he expresses, still resonate today. There's another little phrase that I quite like where he says, they haven't got anything to lose and they've got everything to gain, which it's got echoes of Marx, hasn't it? The idea that people that he's speaking to really have nothing to lose. You've got to realise that the freedoms and the rights, and not the rights in the sense the things that we take for granted, but actually the idea that these people were being legally oppressed in their lives, that their capacity to thrive and take for granted the things that we take for granted, education, education was still segregated. When we talk about busing in some of the states in America, that wasn't something that was opened. Busing meaning to bus in people of colour to previously segregated schools following legislation that was passed in the American government. When you talk about the busing, that wasn't welcomed with open arms in those states, and this is still in the lifetime of my parents. That was still met with people at the gates of those schools, of the view that you will not sit at a table with me, that you will not learn alongside me. And I think that at the root of that, it was still the belief, which is not too far in our past, that people of colour were deemed intellectually inferior to white people. And that's obviously deeply problematic, but it's not too far in our recent history.
How far do you think we've come from then? Do you think that we've got some of this message? Do you think we've made a lot of progress, or are we failing miserably? Give us a report card, sir, of society today. And maybe it's different for UK and US. I don't know if you have opinions on whether we should be separating those two.
I think you're right to make that distinction. Full disclosure, I've never been to the US. I have no knowledge of what that's like as a country. And so if anyone else is in that boat around the table, my knowledge of it is the news we hear. And in recent years, the news that is significant enough from that country to make it over those, to our shores and make it onto news bulletins is not rosy. The news that makes it over onto our news bulletins is about police brutality. I think the election of the first non-white president was significant. I think it was seismic. I think we need to be 30 or 40 or 50 years down the line to fully recognise whether or not it changed the course of history in that country. It still strikes me as a deeply divided country, because there are people who see the Obama moment as significant but I think there are still plenty of people writing, both in this country and in America, about the existence of structural racism and the extent to which it not only limits but perhaps suppresses the capacity of people of colour to achieve their potential.
Do we have any American experts around the table? No American. I've been twice. I don't think that makes me an expert.
I was going to say, I don't think my birthday trip to New York,
Yeah, similar.
to go to the kind of diners where off-Broadway stars
Yeah.
sing while they bring you your menus,
Yeah.
has given me a very good knowledge of what things are like in ordinary America.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I've been to North Carolina, which I suppose
okay.
is
That's
more,
more like it.
slightly more,
Mm.
but they live like, I mean, I'm just going to generalise. Everybody lives so far apart from each other, and my brother lives in like a really, well, now he lives in South Carolina, which is, you know. But anyway, but everybody lives in these very atomised communities. It's really weird. You have to drive miles. Like he'll drive 15 minutes just to get a Starbucks, and I won't even go into the environmental implications of that. But it's very weird. So there's no sense that he can just remove his life from any real, you know, real life, quote unquote, going on in cities. So you can't really get a proper feel for it. So it feels like there must be a divide because people are living in these totally different worlds. But I'm certainly no America expert. I better not get my brother to listen to this podcast now. Oh, right. Other avenues. We've not got a huge amount of time left. We do want to have time for quick fire questions. But are there any burning final things you want to add that
I've
you
got
think?
one.
Oh, I'm excited.
Do you think that it was because of his unstable and interrupted childhood which radicalized him into the person he grew up to be?
I think the idea that individuals turn to crime for any one single reason is perhaps always going to be an oversimplification. It's undoubtedly true that his experience as a child was troubled. It's undoubtedly true that his own behaviours in and around the time he went to prison, you know, like I said, sort of, I think arson was one of the things he was involved in, robbery and small, not small crimes. Not small crimes.
We're not inviting you to try them out, guys.
Not small crimes to a middle class teacher like me, but you know, relatively speaking, crimes for which he didn't serve an extended period of time in prison. So perhaps it was, but I think that while your younger years are always formative, I think that the biggest factor that shaped his views politically in the early 1960s up until his death in 1965 was the deeply entrenched political and societal structure of the United States at that time. He was an individual and a renowned individual at that time, but there were scores and scores and millions of black people around that country who were experiencing inequality in its harshest forms.
Thank you.
That's a fair answer.
I had another thing to add. I think because I was doing some research on Malcolm X earlier, so I believe the reason he turned to crime after he moved to New York when he was 18 was because people around him came to him having black stereotypes of that time in mind, so coming to him asking for drugs and things like that, and I believe that was why he turned to such a life of crime. Have we, as a society again, had further steps away from such stereotypes, or are they still sort of underlying?
So far as the extent to which people of colour can make progress educationally and professionally in this country as compared to where it was however many years ago my dad came to this country. 67, my dad came to this country, 55 years ago. It's clearly improved. It's highly unlikely that the success that I've enjoyed in my life professionally would have been as possible 40 years ago or 50 years ago. and I think we should never lose sight of that. The privilege and opportunity that my children will have is certainly testament to where we are as a country. But inequalities still remain. You only have to look at any form of data to look at whether it's people who are affected by a health crisis, or whether it's people whose education attainment differs from different groups, whether it's the wealth inequality that exists in this country. A little COVID reference, because it still resonates in our consciousness. One of the things that came out was talking about households that were multi-generational and the way in which they were disproportionately affected during the COVID outbreak. I know of not a single person who is Muslim or Pakistani who has a grandparent in a care home. It's culturally, it's not a cultural anomaly, but it's almost not even considered culturally that would happen. My grandmother stayed with us when we were children. My grandfather stayed with my cousin, each of them until the day they died. The idea that grandparents would be put in care was anathema. And so those inequalities still exist, and they're almost an extension of the ways in which the families, in this case from sort of the Asian subcontinent, still live their lives.
Gosh, we could have a whole nother podcast going down that rabbit hole. Sadly, we haven't got time. But I know Sarah's going to want to lighten the tone now.
Well, no, I think actually it might be quite nice to leave it on, because we're running out of time, but nice to leave it. I thought it was some really thoughtful
No, I really, yeah.
bits at the end of that, and I think that's a really interesting thing.
Fair enough.
But there is, for regular listeners, I thought we could begin another series of...
impossible clues.
No clues. Well, interesting each time, and there'll be maybe a number. So I'm going to start a new sequence, and there'll be a prize. So Ben in year 12 was very impressed. Ben in year 13 now was very impressive in getting the last one, the Roman Emperor's one. So the clue for this first episode, email in if you know where this is going. But the clue is a phrase. First clue is a phrase. And the phrase is the informal opening.
Oh my gosh, is that it, sir?
The informal opening. That's the phrase. That is the first clue. Email in if you think you know what I'm on about.
Nobody knows what you're on about, sir, apart from maybe Ben in year 13. He seems to know how your mind works. So
Ben's emailing as we speak.
Yeah, he hasn't even heard it yet, but he knows. He knows instinctively. Well, thank you so much for having us today. We've had a bit of a different format in the way we're set out, but hopefully this podcast will come together beautifully edited. I'm sure Harry will help me if I need it. Oh no, he's not looking very hopeful there. But it's been so fascinating, and I felt like we could have talked to Sir for hours and unpacked his encyclopedic knowledge, and maybe we'll come back to this another time. Maybe we'll take it in some new directions. But thank you so much to Mr. Khan for being a fabulous guest. Thank you to my lovely panellists, Addy, Josh, and Harry. Thank you to Mr. Till for, being
always
Mr. Till.
a pleasure, never a chore.
And I hope you will, follow us in all the usual places, tweet us out at JHGS English and so on, and take care of yourselves. And have a wonderful week. And we will come back to you very, very, very soon. Hopefully with Mr. Durrant next week, who's threatening to talk about Stanislavski, which I know absolutely very little about.
Be there or be square.
I know. How could you miss out on that? We'll see. Thank you. Bye.